So Geetanjali, we're really excited to have you on. We're talking about so many different topics we want to discuss today. I guess first place to start, obviously I noticed that you did your master's while working. We'll talk about that challenge, but maybe just talk about your master's because I found it as a topic very interesting. So maybe you could explain what you did and what you wrote about.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure speaking with you in the past as well. So really excited to be here. So just to give a bit of background on how I first got into that master's thesis as well. Um, so I started at McGill in 2017. Did a master's in finance there, and it was I took that time at the masters to kind of uncover what I'm really interested in, especially in a career in finance. And in doing so, I realized that there's a few things that are important for me or to me, which was being sort of at the nexus of finance, technology, and impact in terms of be it gender diversity or climate change. And so that's where I kind of geared my energy towards, especially for my thesis. And I had some good mentors at school who helped me kind of get behind that. And what I decided to do was a thesis on or study kind of the Canadian EVC ecosystem to see, what is what is the sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
It's okay. It's okay.
Sorry. So the goal was basically to study the Canadian VC ecosystem and understand, how do women compare or women-founded companies compare versus male-founded companies when it comes to raising a subsequent round of financing. And it's always a timely discussion to have. And it's odd that even in 2020 or 2017, back then, it was still a conversation or a big topic in the sense that people have to talk about this. And it wasn't the most obvious thing that okay, we should have sort of this balance in financing or funding and roles versus in different organizations and so on. So basically that was kind of the underlying view of what I was trying to do with it. And the results were, there was no surprise there. It's women founded companies, even if it's one founder or a mixed team of say one women or one male founder, they've had lower financing or lower probability of kind of raising the next round of financing. And it was a good 10 to 15, or I think it's up to 20% lower chance of raising next round. So that kind of tells you that there's definitely a lot of bias when it comes to there can be some bias when it comes to investing in different startups. And it also comes from the fact that our networks are not as diverse when it comes to when we're hiring people for investment firms, or when we're looking at different companies or sourcing companies from the same kind of homogeneous network. So that was kind of how I got around to it. And I was and that's kind of also what pushed me to get into venture investing, growth equity, and just private equity in general. And Yeah.
Yeah, were you surprised with the results of your thesis? Like obviously, I imagine you had a few ideas when you started like writing and researching it, but yeah, was it shocking at all to you?
It was, I think, I knew, looking just at the data set that I had, I think I had a sense of what the results would be. And the other thing is that it's not documented, or there's not enough companies that are in the data pool. So there can be some, the weight of the information can be downplayed a little bit. So the accuracy can shift with that. But I think given that there's a lot of research on this otherwise as well, that there is bias when people come and look at companies to invest in. They ask different questions to a male or a female founder, and there's a study by Harvard, and that's really interesting and eye-opening. And So it wasn't as surprising as I would have thought it would be, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and it's really interesting, and it's funny because you mentioned 2017. It's like it's not that long ago,
Yeah.
so it's like it feels like the narrative has progressed, but probably not necessarily as much when it comes to results of like the actual change occurring. Any thoughts on like on this particular topic? So how like A, do you think there's been actual change, and then B, how do we then promote more female entrepreneurship and like obviously on the investment side as well? Well, you need also diversity, not just in what you fund, but the people funding it itself, right? And I think you're a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, and just a quick fact on that. I think I read it in one of Canadian research that it spoke about how if you look at the senior level or partner level at all the VC or investing firms, you'll realize that there's not enough gender diversity there. At the decision making table, right? But if you look at the lower sort of junior investment professionals now, there's more balance there. So what makes me think that is that over time, as we all in our generation get promoted to the next levels, I think that gender balance will emerge eventually. And so that, for one, can help bring in that diverse network around us for the firm in general, and help bring in additional companies that are not the same, not the same kind of companies, not just like technology wise, but founder diversity wise. So I think that with time it will definitely change, and I think a lot is being done in terms of venture funding and generally towards businesses. The Canadian government has a lot of initiatives. There's the BDC, Women in Tech Fund, and a lot of other funds here in Toronto as well, that are solely focused on investing in women founded businesses. So I think what the hope is that with this, we won't need any specific fund. I think eventually that needs to focus on a specific kind of. I don't want to call it social issue because I don't want it to be a social issue, but eventually it won't. You won't need specific funds that need to invest in a certain kind of business or certain social character. So and that we move away from that, and everybody will not will focus on all kinds of diverse investments and so on.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. When you finish your thesis, did you already have a plan to get into venture, into like into that space, or did it kind of like how should I say the thesis itself kind of like propelled you? I'm like, oh, this would be interesting to kind of work and explore the field.
Yeah, and it was around the time that I was interviewing for positions in the investment world. So it was, I think, at the back of my mind, I knew that was sort of the natural progression for me because as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to be at that nexus of technology, finance, and impact. And so that really kind of pushed me to explore opportunities in that space, and investments in private equity came out to be one that would really help me fulfill that.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. So then talk to us about MKB. What the firm is, and then your role there.
Sure. Yeah. So MKB, well, I joined MKB in 2018, right after my master's, actually. And so we launched over a decade ago as a vehicle for our founders and the network to make private investments in renewable energy. And that led to our first investment in Potentia Solar, now Potentia Renewables. And they're an Ontario-based rooftop solar power producer, and we raised this dedicated SPV to make investments where we had family offices and high net worth individuals come alongside us. So, and a similar approach was used for our next investment in Myovision Technologies. They're a company based out of Kitchener, Waterloo, and they're focused on digitizing traffic infrastructure. And this investment basically was our first foray into transportation. And so in 2016, we expanded our scope of activities, and we launched our first specialized fund with a mandate to invest in next generation energy and transportation. While broadening, we had a lot of different LP or LP base expanded to include foundations and institutions. And this fund now is fully invested, and we're a diverse with a diverse set of companies that are operating in off-grid solar, car sharing, electric grid digitization, last mile mobility, and transportation data. So we've had, and now earlier just last year we launched our successive fund, which is larger in size and with a similar mandate, and we announced our first close just a couple of months ago. So that's a bit on MKB. And in terms of my role, it on a daily basis it changes, but I think the core of what my role is, for investment sourcing, execution, or doing the due diligence, and doing all the background stuff on that, and then there's one on reporting where we report to our investors, and then supporting our portfolio companies with any future decision making or so on and so forth. And other than that, I think that's more on the finance role. And the other part is also that it's such a people's business. It's all about creating connections or building a network around yourself, because that's how you kind of expand your scope and source investments, or find, it's not just about sourcing investments, but also create a network that would support your portfolio company eventually if needed. Or and also the other hats that we end up wearing in our roles are, just on the marketing side also. So building that, building the sort of the, yeah. And so it's been 3 years, and I think I've been very, very lucky in terms of, being able to join a firm where I found really true role models, and that have supported me through this journey of, transitioning, as a newcomer in Canada, and then just in my role in general as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great story, right? Like I think the joke you had told me before is like, how long have you been in Canada? It's like it's been 4 winters, so it's like a short but impactful journey so far in the country. So what I find amazing also is just how interesting MKB is as a firm in terms of like their investment thesis and the sectors you guys invest. Do you have any more context around the vision around this thesis? Like, you mentioned like energy, transportation, right? So just generally attacking this big beast of climate change. So like, how do you guys approach your investments?
So it's when we started 10 years ago, I think we saw this generational shift. There's been cost declines, especially if you look at solar. There's been massive cost declines. There's more service-based businesses that have come along, and it's an investable sector, as against, a lot of information, or based on, or bias based on the last clean tech boom and bust cycle. It's People are now, in light of the pandemic, for example, in this general sense of panic around climate change, and this growing focus on impact and ESG and energy transition. People are realizing that, you can have an impact, a positive impact, without really sacrificing returns. And people are realizing that this focus will remain for the medium to long term. So and we've always believed that, there's an opportunity here in terms of, not just to make money, but also to create an impact, and especially in transportation and energy, which, contribute to a big chunk of greenhouse gas emissions overall. And there's so much innovation happening. There's a lot of innovation to be had. And if you've seen any of the, for example, if you're tracking the stock market at all, you'll be familiar with the word SPAC. And a lot of businesses are pursuing that as an opportunity in the transportation sector. And there's this race to electrify transportation. It didn't. It the technology has evolved, and it's going to continue to evolve, and the size of the opportunity is so large. It's we're talking every car on the street here that's going to be electric, essentially. So it's and that's kind of what we're gonna keep continue to work for. And as we and not just that, actually, for MKB in particular, we're also expanding our platform to focus as well on food and ag, because they're also major greenhouse gas emitting sectors. So that's something we're also exploring.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. You mentioned, I just want to go back to micropoint. You mentioned SPACs, right? And particularly in the EV space.
Mhm.
Um, Curious if you've been following it. I find on my end, it's like obviously it's a good thing that we're funding more of these EV companies, but it does also kind of look a little bit like a bubble where these EV companies are essentially going public without products and without revenue, right? And we saw one or two pretty big examples, but now there's even more. And like, if you look at their projections of like, oh, we will have $10 billion within 3 years. It's like, that's a bit up. Sounds a bit optimistic, right? That you'll break every land speed record of revenue growth. Of course, the market seems to be getting there, but we're just curious as to like, do you think it's frothy? Do you think it's actually, like, yeah, just curious to get your thoughts on this because I feel like it makes sense, but some of it doesn't.
Yeah, it's with almost every other sort of sector that goes through that cycle. And I think there are a lot of businesses out there that are raising a lot of funding upfront to finance their business plans and execute on them based on that financing, essentially. So and there's obviously some businesses that are still in the product development phase, and the hope there is that they do execute on it. And it may happen that the uptake or the projection that they're showing, it may be slow to materialize, but the hope is that they manage to get there closer to where they want to be. And because this is, I mean, finance and valuations and investments and private equity, keeping them aside for a second, I think the climate change is a real problem. And hopefully I want to be optimistic. Obviously there are businesses that are raising a lot of money at a very high valuation. However, but at the same time, there are so many businesses that we've come across that have a real product, that have been rolling it out for a while and have real sales, and will be executing on their business plans with this financing. So excited to see how it pans out in the near and medium term. But
Yeah, interesting. Yeah,
sorry.
it's very interesting. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I find it's like, yeah, generally there are more and more opportunities, and like yeah, like giving a lot of these projects more funding is not a bad thing per se. And the winners will win essentially. What do you, actually then diving into this maybe a bit more? Like, what do you see as the key areas that you find more interesting these days, right? So you mentioned EV. I know you guys have invested like Add Energy at Quebec City, a really interesting project with Louis Tremblay and what their team is doing over there. So
Mhm.
just curious as to like where do you see the big zones that you're interested slash passionate?
Sure. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, it's this with this pandemic, and the sense of urgency around climate change has really refocused and shifted people's attention to kind of look at businesses that are creating a positive impact, and they're realizing that they can do it without sacrificing on returns. So and that's, I think, really interesting here. And just talking about MKB's core sectors, for example, for energy and transportation, there's a number of trends that have emerged in the last few years, and what we expect, and which we expect will continue to gain momentum for the next few years. And we've seen with the SPAC market, it's going crazy, but I think the race to electrify transportation is here to stay, and we're going to keep seeing better businesses evolve, and contributing to the overall electrification of transportation, and especially on the charging side, on the electric vehicle, or the vehicle in itself as well, and around that. And then we're also seeing this consumerization of energy and a focus on customer engagement, focus on bidirectional energy and consumption, energy consumption and production. Because now you can put solar rooftop, and you can sell. Eventually, can will be able to sell additional power from your EV battery back into the grid. So allowing that buying and selling, that ease in doing that, I think is going to evolve as well. And then there's AI applications, machine learning applications for real-time energy management technology and energy efficiency. And then one of the interesting ones that I am following as well is the last mile mobility, for the third lane that I like to call, and another one is automating parts of the supply chain transport, and this is just to name a few.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe this double clicking on that last mile delivery piece, I find it's a I'm not sure if this is maybe just an erroneous thought, but it's like, like the concept of like, well, if you buy from Amazon, it's actually creating more pollution because there's more trucks on the road. But then the counterpoint to that is, well, if 50 people are not driving to the shopping mall and it's just one truck, that
Mm.
delivers to 50 homes, what's the actual carbon footprint there, right? So curious to hear you a bit on that last mile delivery, where you think we'll see, savings in carbon.
Yeah, on the last mile, especially on the last mile portion of the supply chain, which is basically from the warehouse to a person's house, a lot of savings can come from optimizing the way the deliveries are scheduled. So in one region, one time the truck goes and delivers in one go. And I think a part of it also depends on this instant gratification from consumers, this instant need of having everything same day delivery. I think if people kind of ease off on that, would also go a long way. But I think a lot of companies from are also kind of providing an option to people to either you do the same day delivery at a cost, or or you take X number of days or whatever days it takes for the company to kind of send that package across to you, and that's the more eco-friendly sort of option available to them. So I think a lot can be done on that front. And we're also seeing, on the middle mile of the supply chain, which is from getting the products to the warehouse, and from a central hub, and that's a very repetitive sort of journey that that a truck, for example, takes. And where the opportunity lies in that is kind of making it autonomous. So that's also pretty interesting from that front. And if those autonomous trucks are electric, then that's a bonus.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that's it. It goes back to EV. Once we get to EV, then it doesn't really
Exactly.
matter as much.
Yeah.
What about carbon capture? Is that something you have an opinion on? You're knowledgeable about? I find it's an interesting like way to like accelerate or decelerate. I want to say the heating of the planet.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting part of sort of the ecosystem, which I personally don't look at. But I know that if that technology can work, it'll help sort of decrease the effort that it takes to remove carbon from the society, I think. And there's a lot of interesting ventures that are taking that carbon from the atmosphere and plugging that into cement, for example. So there's a lot of interesting technologies there.
Hmm.
And I'm personally not, I don't know too much
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's all good. I was just curious. Well, actually, on that front, what do you think is exciting that's coming around the corner, but that doesn't have widespread recognition yet? So like like rookies like me are like, oh, carbon capture seems cool, but what do you think is like what do you think are technologies that are not at scale yet, but that have a potential impact?
Yeah, and it's this the digitization of the sort of the energy network. I think a lot of people move away, or get scared of digitizing, let's say, infrastructure, because it's infrastructure and it's scary for early stage or late stage investors. But I think that's something that's really a core part of how things will evolve, especially if you look at the AMI rollouts, which is basically your smart meter. And that can facilitate so much more than what we can do today. And with the smart meters rolled out, there's so much data we can capture when everybody has a smart meter installed, and it's just a matter of time when that gets installed. You can have so many data applications that you can layer on that, and really lead to a lot of efficiencies at the home and how you consume energy essentially.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like you said, like we're still kind of in the analog phase of electricity, right? Like increase, temperature to 22.5, and like there's some interesting, yeah, interesting initiatives. Like I think Quebec, Hydro Quebec has their, their project called ELO that's trying to like make the smart home, smart thermostat, but it seems so nascent still, right? So like having a smart grid eventually. Obviously, there's kind of the fear of the cyber attacks. What happens when you connect it to like the internet? Well,
Yeah.
but barring that, I think it just has huge potential to the with energy savings. And to your previous point, I think it's also connected to being able to re-inject energy into the grid, right? So it's like the kind of the Tesla sales pitch of the power pack on the home and putting that back into the grid. So I
Mhm.
find those two are fascinating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the grid till now has been, there's only a one way supply or one way movement of of electricity. But with these technologies, with so much of accelerated use of solar rooftop and behind the meter uh, energy resources, there's so a lot of bidirectional movement happening, and utilities need the full view of what's happening. And once you have a lot of these distributed resources of energy, you can aggregate all of that, and there's a lot of that you can create a virtual power plant in some ways. And so there's a lot interesting stuff happening in this space, and I'm really excited in general.
Does it change at all the investor mindset? Like, does return on invested capital change in terms of mindset because the time periods are longer? Does it change, yeah, how you approach investment from a return perspective, or is that maybe not the right question?
I think, as I mentioned, we any fund that's investing in you can have a financial return and market financial return uh, without and while creating a positive impact, and you don't have to sacrifice on that return. So I think yeah, that's my train of thought, sorry.
It's all good. It's all good.
But yeah.
Yeah, so you're saying it's like it doesn't really change much, right? It's like these are great projects. They'll generate free cash flow, and like they'll be good valuations, and there'll be other investors that'll want to like come later on to like pick up the baton, so to speak, to continue investing at later stages as well.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think a lot of the funds that are investing in these sectors, they have it's called patient capital. It understands, that it's the 5 to 10 year time horizon. And I think it's pretty standard for most funds to look at that sort of time horizon. And there's definitely, as you mentioned, there's that there can be exits along the way, where because a lot of these technology one thing that's interesting is that a lot of these technologies are really new, and we're talking about them, and they're disrupting how the incumbents have been doing business, right? So for incumbents to really innovate, they they do end up purchasing or acquiring these newer business models, which are mostly software as against their mostly consulting or hardware equipment sales. So there's a lot of innovation that they're looking at increasingly for themselves to stay relevant, and it makes a really nice opportunity for them to for the companies also in this space to operate.
yeah, amazing, amazing. Gitanjali, I don't want to keep you more. It's been an amazing conversation. Like I have like a lot of homework and research to do. Maybe final question is if people want to learn more about the work you guys are doing or just connect with you, what's the best way?
It's by email, our website, our LinkedIn page. We're all available at all times, and all our information is out there.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to speak with you.